Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Imagine a king, powerful one day, locked in his own castle. How did Eduardo II of England, in the 14th century, pray to his own crown? Discover its tragic story, subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. Think of a king wrapped in mystery, a monarch whose reign was marked by controversy and scandal. Eduardo II, King of England in the 14th century, was not a common ruler. His personal life, full of secrets and accusations, even today arouses fascination and debate. Was he a weak man, manipulated by his favorites, or a ruler with a different vision, advanced to his time, who paid a high price for his audacity? His relationship with Piers Gaveston, a noble of humble origin, deeply marked his reign. Gaveston became an intimate advisor, even a favorite, generating the wrath of the English nobility. The opposition to his reign grew, fueled by the perception that Gaveston exercised excessive control over the king, destabilizing the kingdom. But Eduardo II was not just a king wrapped in love scandals. Certain administrative reforms and improvements in the infrastructure of the kingdom are also attributed. However, these actions were eclipsed by the struggle of power with the barons and the growing unpopularity of their favorites. His reign, in short, was a complex game of intrigues, alliances, and betrayals. His life, I tell you, began in the midst of political turbulence. Eduardo II, a young prince, inherited a kingdom shaken by wars and internal disputes. Imagine the pressure. To be the heir to the throne of England in such a convulsive era, with powerful nobles struggling for control and the people suffering the consequences of instability. His father, Eduardo I, a formidable and ambitious king, bequeathed a large kingdom, but also a legacy of unsolved conflicts. From a young age, Eduardo was surrounded by intrigues and conspiracies. The English court was a hotbed of ambitions, where each nobleman sought their own benefit. He, just a child, was forced to navigate these treacherous waters, learning to survive in a world where loyalty was a luxury and betrayal. The current currency, IT, was not an easy childhood, at all. The shadow of war and uncertainty accompanied him from the beginning. When he finally ascended to the throne, Eduardo II inherited a fractured kingdom. The wars with Scotland were still unresolved. The nobles fought for power and the economy was in crisis. Think about the burden that it represented for a young king, practically without experience, faced with such a complex and dangerous situation. He had to impose his authority, maintain peace and, above all, survive. A monumental challenge for such a young king. But barely crowned, Eduardo II made a mistake that would cost him expensive. His obsession with Piers Gaveston. Piers, a Gascon gentleman of humble origin, but with an overwhelming personality, became the favorite of the king. Imagine the scene. A young monarch, surrounded by the pomp and the circumstance of the court, completely captivated by this man. His ascent was meteoric, going from being a simple companion to the real advisor, accumulating wealth and power by leaps and bounds. Gaveston's influence on Eduardo II was total. He appointed his friends to important positions, completely ignoring the English nobility. Can you imagine the fury of the nobles, accustomed to having a considerable weight in the affairs of the kingdom, being relegated to the background by a foreigner? His political decisions, guided by the Gaveston Council, began to generate deep instability in the kingdom. The situation became unsustainable. The barons, outraged by real favoritism and the growing power of Gaveston, rebelled. They exiled on Piers, but Eduardo II's blind loyalty made him bring him back. This act of challenge only served to enliven the flames of the rebellion. The coronation of a young and passionate king was becoming a political nightmare of epic proportions. His rise caused the anger of the powerful English barons. They saw not only a real favorite in Gaveston, but a threat to their influence and power. They accused of corruption pieces, of enriching themselves at the expense of the kingdom and, above all, of manipulating the king for their own benefit. You will see how this growing tension, fed by whispers and palatial intrigues, would become a perfect storm. The barons, led by influential figures such as Los Condes de Lancaster and Warwick, demanded the expulsion of Gaveston. Eduardo II, blind for his loyalty and affection towards his favorite, refused. This refusal caused the first of many confrontations. The loyalty of the king to Gaveston was interpreted as a contempt for the nobility, a challenge to tradition and an affront to his own rights. Prosody. Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The pressure intensified. The barons, unhappy and with popular support, threatened with the open war. Eduardo II, inexperienced in politics and surrounded by ineffective counselors, underestimated the determination of his opponents. The situation became unsustainable. The threat of a civil war in England, and Gaveston, the man who had led him to this situation, would become the scapegoat of the anger of the nobility. The situation became unsustainable. The barons, led by influential figures such as Thomas de Lancaster, were not willing to tolerate Gaveston's power. Accusations of betrayal and corruption resonated in each corner of the court. You could imagine the palpable tension, the latent threat of a civil war that signed over England. The patience of the nobles had been exhausted, and the fury of their armies prepared to unleash their anger. The king, blind for his loyalty to Gaveston, tried to resist, but the force of the barons was overwhelming. Imagine the scene. Besieged castles, bell battles, sword creak and war clamored. It was a struggle for power, a struggle for the very destiny of England. Popular support leaned towards barons, increasingly outraged by real favoritism. Gaveston, despite his arrogance, was finally captured. His destiny was sealed. Remember the image. A powerful man, reduced to impotence, waiting for his sentence. The triumphant barons demanded justice. The execution of Gaveston marked the end of an era, the end of his excessive influence on the king. But did this mean peace? The answer, as you will see, was a resounding. Gaveston's defeat brought an apparent calm, but the tension in the court was still latent. You, as a spectator, observed the arrival of Isabel de France, a young queen with a dazzling beauty, but with a heart full of ambition and resentment towards the influence of the barons in her husband's life. His marriage to Eduardo II, although initially promising, quickly became a source of conflicts. Eduardo, more interested in his favorites and luxury than in state affairs, failed to understand his wife's aspirations. Isabel, intelligent and cunning, saw in her husband's weakness an opportunity to consolidate her own power. The lack of affection and the difference in interest between the two, accentuated by the interference of the nobility, was undermining the stability of the crown. The court was divided into factions, each looking for its own benefit. You are witnessing how the rivalry between the queen and the barons intensifies, creating an environment of conspiracies and betrayals. Isabel, although initially isolated, begins to weave strategic alliances, seeking the support of those who shared their discontent with the reign of Eduardo II. But the apparent peace broke soon. The barons, humiliated by the influence of Gaveston and resentful of Eduardo's perceived weakness, rose again in arms. You are witnessing how the English, divided and ambitious nobility joins its own king, forming a relentless front. The country plunged into the chaos of the Civil War, with besieged castles and bell battles that dyed the fields of England red. Eduardo, a king accustomed to luxury and comfort, was suddenly besieged. His castles, once a symbol of power and opulence, became besieged strengths, under the constant siege of the rebels. Imagine the despair of the king, locked between stone walls, listening to the roar of the catapults and the clamor of the enemy warriors. The war lasted, exhausting the resources and morals of both sides. You see how loyalty falls apart. Trade ions and changing alliances mark the rhythm of the contest. Eduardo, caught in his own maze of power, is increasingly isolated, surrounded by enemies both inside and outside his walls. The image of a powerful king fades, replaced by that of a desperate monarch, fighting for his survival. After the humiliation suffered at the hands of the barons, Eduardo II's position was considerably weakened. His inability to control his nobles and his insistence on favoring his favorites, such as Piers Gaveston, isolated him even more of the English nobility. You see how distrust is installed between the king and his subjects, undermining his authority and prestige. His taste for luxury and extravagance, in contrast to the poverty of many of his subjects, increased his unpopularity. Excessive court expenses and the perception that Eduardo II cared more about his personal pleasures than about the needs of the kingdom fed popular discontent. You are witnessing how disapproval murmurs become a growing cry. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%, the growing influence of his favorites, not only Gaveston, but also other men surrounding the king, generated suspicions of corruption and favoritism. The perception that the king was being manipulated and that the important decisions were made for the benefit of a few, instead of the kingdom, further eroded their credibility. You observe how confidence in the monarch fades irremediably. The court became a hotbed of whispers and betrayals. You could feel the tension in the air yourself, every look, every word, loaded with a hidden meaning. The barons, hungry for power and resentful of the king's weakness, wove a network of conspiracies, looking for a way to get rid of Edoardo II and seize the throne. Roger Mortimer, an ambitious and cunning man, erected himself as the central figure of this plot. Its influence grew day by day, feeding discontent and sedition among the nobles. He, along with other conspirators, moved the threads from the shadows, manipulating events and people to achieve his goal, to overthrow the king. Queen Elizabeth, initially loyal to her husband, was wrapped in the conspiracy. Motivated by ambition or perhaps by resentment towards Edoardo II and his lovers, she allied with Mortimer, becoming a key piece into the plan to overthrow the king. His loyalty change marked a turning point in the struggle for power. Among the shadows of the Palaciga intrigue, a figure arose that would eclipse all the others. Hugh Pantincer, the young man that I bet, ambitious and cunning. The attention of King Edoardo II quickly captivated. His friendship, at first discreet, became an almost sickly dependence. You could observe how Panzer, with its charm and its ability to manipulate, became the closest confidant of the monarch, whispering advice from an increasingly isolated king. This new and powerful influence in court caused the anger of the nobles. You presented how the barons, already unhappy with Edoardo's reign, saw in Panzer a threat to their power. The meteoric ascension of Ansar, favored with land and titles, did nothing but feed their grudges. The young real favorite, however, seemed immune to criticism, strengthened by the blind loyalty of the king. The relationship between Edoardo II and Hugh Ansar, the young man, transcended the simple friendship. It became a political alliance, a source of power that challenged the conventions of the time. You could imagine the outrage that this caused in a society governed by rigid codes of honor and feudal loyalty. The influence of Pantincer extended to all areas of real life, from political decisions to the allocation of resources. The king, increasingly dependent on his favorite, moved away from his traditional advisors and his own family. Edoardo II's relationship with Hugh Pantincer, the young man, caused the fury of the English barons. You will see how these powerful nobles, accustomed to influence the court, felt displaced and humiliated by real favoritism towards the pantry. His lands, his privileges, his influence, everything seemed threatened by the growing closeness between the king and his favorites. The barons, led by figures such as Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, joined against the king and the pantry. Imagine the palatial tension, the conspiracies in the shadows, the secret alliances forged in the dark. The English nobility, accustomed to power, was not willing to accept the dominance of some upstarts. The confrontation was inevitable. Slowly, civil wars splashed the kingdom. You will witness the clash between loyalty to the king and the defense of the ancient privileges of the nobility. Its castles, bell battles, England plunged into a civil war that threatened to tear the kingdom's own fabric. So, there were the barons, fed up with the influence of the pantry. You will see how they join, not only for the ambition to recover their power lost in court, but also for a deep feeling of injustice. The opulence of the pantry, financed with the taxes that you, the people, paid, was a constant affront. The drop that filled the glass was the summary execution of some of its allies, accused, without evidence, of betrayal. The rebellion exploded. Imagine the roar of the crowds, the clash of swords, the burning of castles. The barons, with the support of unhappy nobles and a part of the army, marched against Edoardo II. You will witness how the king, confident in the loyalty of his favorites, underestimates the strength of the opposition. He faced an overwhelming force, an army that represented not only the ambition of power, but the cry of a town tired of tyranny. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. The battle was fast and decisive. Edoardo II, betrayed by some of his own men, saw how his army crumbled. The defeat was humiliating. You will see how the king, who once ruled with absolute power, was forced to flee, persecuted by his enemies and abandoned by those who previously swore loyalty. His reign, once bright, became a desperate attempt to hold on to power. But the rebellion was not just something of angry barons. Note how Isabel, the queen, wife of King Edoardo, enters. Discontent with her husband's reign and the influence of the Pantincer, Isabel begins to weave a network of secret alliances. Her beauty and position make her a key piece on the political board, a piece that seeks to change the game in her favor. And there is Roger Mortimer, a powerful and ambitious nobleman, exiled for his opposition to Eduardo II. He sees an opportunity in Isabel, not only to recover his position, but also to take revenge on the king. Its alliance is an explosive mixture of thirst for power and resentment, a dangerous cocktail that will change the course of the history of England forever. Together, urinate a plan to overthrow Eduardo II. Isabel, with her privileged position in court, is responsible for gathering support among the unhappy nobles. Mortimer, with his military experience and his network of contacts, deals with the logistics of the rebellion. His alliance is an open secret, but no one dares to challenge them. The power they represent is too great, it's too dangerous ambition. So, there was Isabel, allied with Mortimer, preparing her blow. Imagine a fleet of ships approaching the English coasts, loaded not only of soldiers, but of the ambition of a scorned queen and the desire for power of a cunning man. The news of his arrival extended like gunpowder, sowing panic in loyal to Eduardo. Eduardo, locked in his castle, faced a betrayal of epic proportions. His allies faded like fog in the strength of the invasion. Meanwhile, you observe how despair takes over the king, caught in a web of conspiracies that he helped to weave. The siege was fast and brutal. The defenses, weakened by the lack of support and internal betrayal, collapsed easily. Think about the images. The fall of the castle doors, the roar of the crowd that bursts, the look of defeat on the monarch's face. The end of his reign was close. The capture of Eduardo II marked the end of an era, a powerful king, reduced to a simple prisoner. His reign, full of controversies and errors, culminated in a humiliating defeat at the hands of his own wife. The story of Eduardo II is a reminder of power, betrayal, and fragility of real power. And so, the invasion took shape. The Battle of Boroughbridge was waiting for you, a muddy and cold battlefield under a threatening sky. Remember the image. Eduardo II, with his loyal ones, facing the forces of Isabel and Mortimer, he, confident in his army, although depleted, ready to defend his crown. But the numerical superiority of his enemies was overwhelming. The roar of men, the clash of swords, the palpable fear in the air. Everything was concentrated at that crucial moment. The battle was fast and brutal. Eduardo's lines broke under the weight of the attack. The strategy failed and confusion reigned. You can imagine the terror in the eyes of the soldiers who saw how their classmates fell, the despair that took over them before enemy superiority. The promise of loyalty, broken by betrayal, the defeat was sealed. The fight for survival became desperate. The king, surrounded, saw how his kingdom crumbled around him. His armor, a symbol of power, was now a cage that imprisoned him. The defeat not only meant the loss of a battle, but the end of his reign. His inevitable capture marked the beginning of a new chapter, dark and full of uncertainty, in the history of England. The crown, a symbol of its power, would soon become a load. The defeat in Boroughbridge marked the end of your reign. Eduardo, do you imagine, chained, driven as a criminal through the muddy streets of a kingdom that was once yours. The roar of the crowd, a mixture of contempt and curiosity, accompanied you. Your pride, your power, faded with each step, replaced by the cold reality of the prison. Your splendor days were left behind. The castle, once a symbol of your authority, now became your jail. Its imposing walls, before witnesses of parties and banquets, now resonated with the echo of your captive steps. Opulence faded, leaving behind the cold stone and the constant threat of uncertainty. The food, formerly exquisite, was now simple and scarce. Your counselors, formerly flatterers, now observed you with a mixture of fear and disdain. Every day was a monotonous repetition of the previous one, a slow agony that eroded your spirit. The loneliness, your new partner, became unbearable, a heavier weight than the chains that imprisoned you. Prosody, speak. Speak to prosody rate equals 90%. The roar of the crowd faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of your prison walls. Kenilworth, once a symbol of power, was now your cage. Imagine the cold moisture that leaked between the stones, the stench to mold and to fear that each corner was permeated your days. Before full of luxuries and power, were reduced to a monotonous and degrading existence. The food, scarce and of poor quality, barely allowed you to stay alive. The guards, faces hardened by cruelty, constantly monitored you, reminding you of your fall and disgrace. Each look, every whisper, reminded you of the loss of your crown and the humiliation of your captivity. Loneliness was your worst torture. Isolated from the outside world, your friends, your family, you faced your own demons. The weight of your mistakes, betrayals, lost wars, crushed you, leaving a deep mark on your soul. The king who ruled England was now just a prisoner, without power or glory. Time stretched, every day a monotonous repetition of the previous one. That hope faded slowly, replaced by deep apathy. Your castle, your kingdom, had become a cruel reminder of the ephemeral power and bitter reality of your captivity. Cold humidity sneaked into your bones, but the thirst for freedom was greater. Kenilworth, with his thick walls and impassive guards, was not going to contain you forever. You started to worn a plan, observing each routine, every carelessness that a tunnel, maybe a distraction that would allow you to escape in the middle of chaos. The idea of the escape obsessed you, day and night, feeding a flame of hope in your heart. Your allies, still loyal in spite of everything, helped you. A nobleman, risking his life, spent detailed plans of the night guards. Another provided rudimentary tools, hidden in a clothing package. Every night, in the dark, you worked in silence, hoping that freedom would be available to your hand. The risk was immense, penalty, death. But luck is not always on your side. A guard alerts any suspicious movement, discovered you. Your plans came down. The sound of the boots approaching, the dry blow of the doors opening, the face of the guard, full of a mixture of fear and resentment, marked you forever. The dream of freedom, for now, vanished between the cold stones of your prison. But the prison did not silence the whispers that in Kenilworth's cold stones. News of the court arrived, fragmented and distorted like a broken mirror. They talked about Isabel, your queen, of their growing power, of their allies, of the intrigues that wove in your name, or perhaps, against yours, was it loyalty or ambition what shone in his eyes? The rumors became weapons, each word a poisoned dart launched from the distance. It was said that Mortimer, your enemy, had taken control of the court, manipulating Isabel to get rid of you, that conspired with unhappy nobles, sowing discord to ensure his own position. Each rumor was a blow, a stab of doubt about the loyalty of those who had previously sworn to fidelity. Could you trust someone? Was there anyone who really loved you free? Others whispered on a possible French invasion, taking advantage of the instability of the kingdom. That chaos reigned in the court, a farce disguised as an order, where the truth was hidden behind a mask of lies and deceptions. The uncertainty of the inside, as dangerous as the humidity of the stones that surrounded you. You needed to know the truth, even as cruel as reality itself. The rumors intensified. They talked about a disease, a quick and fulminating ailment that had ended the king. But you, amid the darkness of your captivity, you felt a stab of distrust, disease, or an orchestrated death with stealth, an end planned by those who longed for your fall? The letters arrived with dropper, full of blurred ink and broken stamps. They mentioned a sudden attack, a brief agony, but nothing conclusive. Ambiguity was a powerful tool in the hands of your enemies. You wondered if you would ever know the truth, if one day you would know how your end had arrived. The official version, an illness-death, seemed like a farce. You knew the veracity of your enemies, their thirst for power, the ease with which they could manipulate the facts at will. Had they poisoned you? Had they killed you in a more cruel and stealthy way? But that disease, did it really exist? You, locked in your cell, listened to whispers, theories that slide like snakes in the shadows. Some speak of veneno, a deadly drink administered by the hand of an enemy. Isabella, the queen, cold and ambitious, wishing the throne for her son, Eduardo III. His influence on the nobles was evident, his power growing. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. Others point to Roger Mortimer, Isabel's lover, a powerful and ruthless man who longed for total control of the kingdom. Would he have ordered his death to eliminate an obstacle on his way? His ambition was notorious, his influence on the queen, undeniable. The shadow of the conspiracy looms over every corner of the castle. The truth, like an elusive ghost, hides behind a curtain of rumors and speculation. Was it a carefully orchestrated plot, or simply the consequence of a disease that took advantage of a weakened and vulnerable king? You, from your prison, you can only contemplate the immensity of doubt, a turbulent sea where the truth and lie are confused. You, watching from your cell, ask yourself, what is Eduardo II? A weak king, manipulated by his favorites, or a victim of palatial intrigues? His reign, marked by instability and war, left a complex legacy. Some remember him for their economic policies, others for their inclination towards luxury and art. But the story, as always, is more than black or white. His relationship with Gaveston, for example, was a scandal that divided the kingdom. For some, a sample of personal affection, for others, a betrayal of the crown and a source of corruption. This controversy, as well as his taste for art and architecture, marked him deeply in collective memory. Today, centuries later, his figure continues to generate debate. Was it an incompetent ruler? A martyr of power struggles? The answer, as is usually the most nuanced than it is believed. His correct or incorrect actions left an indelible mark on English history, making him a controversial figure, but undeniably fascinating. From your cell, the image of a wobble kingdom is drawn in your mind. The reign of Eduardo II, although brief compared to others, left a deep mark. His weakness, his preference for favorites and constant power struggles, destabilized England deeply. Think about the consequences of that chaos. A divided country, vulnerable to the ambitions of its neighbors and plunged into a political uncertainty that would last decades. The civil war that exploded during his reign, although finally suffocated, left deep scars in English society. The nobility, divided into rival features, fought for power, weakening the government's very structure. Imagine the impact on the economy, in the lives of peasants and artisans, victims of violence and instability. The deposition and murder of Eduardo II set a dangerous precedent. The succession to the throne became even more uncertain, fed by the ambitions of the nobles and the lack of a strong heir. His death did not end the struggles of power, but intensified them, creating an environment of intrigue and violence that marked the course of English history for a long time. From your cell, the image of a weak king imposes himself, or was he a man misunderstood by his time? The story, written by the victors, presents it as an ineffective monarch, dominated by their favorites and oblivious to the needs of their kingdom. But what is beyond accusations of incompetence and waste? What would happen if we checked the narrative with a more critical look? Think about the pressures he suffered. The English nobility, eager to power, constantly conspired against him, questioning his authority and seeking to weaken his reign. His decisions, although sometimes critical, were perhaps taken in a context of constant threats and betrayals. Perhaps, its apparent weakness was a survival strategy in a sea of enemies. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, often indicated as proof of his inability to govern, could be interpreted in another way. Was it a sign of weakness or an expression of your personality, your need for affection and loyalty in a hostile world? Perhaps love, instead of incompetence, was the true engine of its decisions. Remember that the story is written by the victors, and the image of Eduardo II has been molded by those who overthrew him. Was it really a weak king, or simply a man who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, victim of the ambitions of a ruthless nobility? The answer, perhaps, is found in the grays between weakness and misunderstanding. From your cell, you wonder what led Eduardo II to make the decisions that led him to this point. Was it really weakness, or a different vision of power? His attachment to Gaveston, for example, was it a show of weakness or a commitment risked by a more efficient government, perhaps even more progressive for his time? The story, written by his enemies, paints him as a weak man easily influenced. But what if the story lies to you? Prosody, /speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Think about the context. A king struggling to maintain control in a convulsive kingdom. Their decisions, often criticized for their lack of pragmatism, could be seen as desperate attempts to maintain peace or consolidate their power. Loyalty to Gaveston. Perhaps it was not a simple matter of affection, but a poorly calculated political strategy, a commitment to an ally who fully trusted that an error of judgment, or a risky decision. Perhaps his personality, his inclination for beauty and art, separated him from the conventions of the time. A king who preferred the cultivation of arts to the brutality of war, was it really a defect? Or a different vision of royalty? One that history, written from the perspective of the warriors, could simply not understand. Analyze its reign beyond the accusations of inefficiency and weakness. Look at your decisions with a critical eye, but also with compassion. From your cell, you think about the impact that Eduardo II's homosexuality had on his reign. In an era where masculinity was defined by military power and procreation, its relationship with Piers Gaveston challenged social norms. The open demonstration of affection between them not only shocked the nobility, but also weakened their political position, becoming a weapon used by their enemies. Remember how the opposition to its relationship with Gaveston became an open revolt. The nobles, jealous of real favoritism and scandalized for their sexual orientation, saw in Gaveston a threat to their power and influence. The narrative that built around their relationship was based on the weakness and inefficiency of a king dominated by his lover, a strategy that resonated in an audience that was already unhappy with his government. To understand the situation, you have to think about the historical context. Homosexuality was not seen as a sexual orientation in the way we understand it today. It was a matter of power, to challenge the established norm, to subvert the social order. The reaction of the nobility was not simply moral, but political. It was a struggle for the control of the kingdom, and Eduardo II's relationship with Gaveston became the symbol of his weakness and decline. But here, in this stone prison, I also remember Isabel de France, my queen. Its beauty, initially a political asset in our marriage, became an obstacle. His family, powerful and ambitious, always sought to influence my reign, often against my wishes. His loyalty, despite my sins, was a lighthouse in the storm of my life. Was she my greatest ally or my greatest adversary? The story, as always, is ambiguous. And then there are my children, Eduardo and Juan. Eduardo, my heir, a child who never fully understood the turbulence that surrounded him. His innocence, a burden in these circumstances. Did I protect him enough? Or my own struggle for power exposed it too soon to the deadly game of the English court? As for Juan, my youngest son, his destiny, linked to mine, was sealed by the ambition of others. A pawn in the power game that defined my reign. An innocent child caught in the network of intrigues and betrayals that my enemies wove. Could I have done something different to protect them? The question torments me, even here, in my confinement. Otterus, he betrayed me. You will see, the monarchy in England at that time was not a matter of absolute power. I was the king, yes, but my power depended largely on the barons, noble landowners with their own armies and an immense influence in Parliament. They were the cornerstone of the system, and their loyalty or their lack of it determined my destiny. They had the power to challenge me, to oppose my decisions, even to rebel openly if they considered that my actions went against their interests. Remember that they controlled large extensions of land, private years, and possessed immense wealth. His consent was essential for any important decision, from tax collection to the declaration of war. My marriage to Isabel was a clear example of the intricate power network. His family, the French Capitos, were powerful allies, but also a potential threat. The English barons saw in my marriage an opportunity to strengthen their own positions, or to weaken if I did not play my letters well. The policy was a game of alliances and betrayals, a chessboard where each piece, including the king, was at constant risk. But let's go back to the economy, which was the true nerve of war or peace. You imagine a powerful kingdom, right? Well, reality was more complex. Wool, the basis of our wealth, suffered constant fluctuations in the market. A good year meant prosperity for merchants and a decent tax collection for the crown, but a bad harvest. Oh, my friend! It meant hunger, discontent, and, of course, less money in the real coffers. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. Agriculture, the basis of everything, was capricious. It depended on the weather, pests, and luck. A bad harvest could lead to hunger and revolts. And those revolts, believe me, were much more dangerous than any palatial conspiracy. People with an empty stomach did not care about disputes between nobles. He worried about surviving. The trade, although flourishing in certain areas, was subject to taxes and tariffs that sometimes strangled the economy. The barons, those who betrayed me, controlled important trade routes, demanding their share of the cake, leaving little for the crown and for the people. It was a complex system, a maze of confronted interests where prosperity was a mirage and crisis, a constant threat. But returning to Eduardo II, imagine his life in the midst of all this. You, a king, surrounded by a complex court, full of intrigues and struggles for power. Think of lavish banquets, music and dance, in religion that permeated every aspect of life, from morning prayers to great processions. Remember that the church had immense power, influencing everyone's culture, and daily life. The daily life for most was not so splendid. You, a peasant, working the land of dawn at dusk, fighting hunger and disease. Imagine life in a small medieval town, with their wooden and straw houses, the church in the center, the people gathered in the square, sharing stories and concerns. The community was essential to survive. Art and architecture reflected the faith and power of the time. You, walking through the streets of a medieval city, admiring the imposing Gothic cathedrals, with their colorful stained glass and their pointed arches. Think of illuminated manuscripts, true works of art, which contained religious and literary texts, carefully decorated with gold and vibrant colors. They were symbols of the culture and spirituality of the time. Imagine the imposing walls of its castle, robust stones that challenged the passage of time, mute witnesses of their joys and misfortunes. Think of the upper, pointed towers as spears directed to heaven, each one piece of a complex defensive architecture. They were wars, castles that were not only real residences, but also impregnable strengths. Inside, the opulence of the court was reflected in the tapestries that adorned the walls, hunting scenes and battles embroidered with gold thread, a luxury that contrasted with the austerity of peasant life. Look at the details of the stained glass, art pieces that leaked the light, creating a mysterious and magical atmosphere in the royal chapels and rooms. Each piece, a masterpiece of Gothic art. The art of the 14th century was a reflection of society. Religious, but also showing the growing wealth and power of the monarchy. Look at the sculptures, many of them representing biblical figures or kings and queens, with thorough details and an expression of power and solemnity. Think of the music that resonated in the halls, the Gregorian songs and the courtly melodies, a reflection of the splendor of life in the royal court. Now imagine daily life within those imposing walls. You, in the skin of a courtier, get up at dawn in a cold room, with the sound of the servants preparing for the day. The smell of wood and newly polished wax wraps you while you dress with your best clothes, observing how the sun's rays are filtered through the windows with stained glass windows. Breakfast is a simple meal, bread, meat and wine, but served with an elegance that reflects real power. Then, the day is filled with audiences, palatial intrigues and the constant presence of the court. You see how the nobles move, their dresses embroidered with gold and silver threads, their conversations loaded with power and ambition. You participate in some ceremony, perhaps a formal dinner, where music and dance accompany the sumptuous banquets, a contrast between opulence and political instability that is breathed in the environment. In the afternoon, you may find yourself in the gardens of the castle, a space of relative tranquility where you can get away from the bustle of the court. You look at the carefully cultivated flowers, listen to the song of the birds and feel the fresh breeze on your face. But even here, the shadow of real power and conspiracies accompany you, reminding you that even in the moments of apparent calm, political tension persists. At nightfall, candles illuminate the room of the castle, creating an intimate and mysterious atmosphere. Dinner is as sumptuous as noon, but the conversation is more relaxed, although always with an intrigue background. The day ends, but life in court continues its course, incessant and full of secrets. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. Think now in other kings of the time. Eduardo III, his son, inherited a kingdom at war, but knew how to consolidate it with military cunning. Unlike his father, Eduardo III projected the image of a strong and capable monarch. What would have happened if Eduardo II had shown that same firmness? Perhaps the history of England would have been very different, without those internal struggles and the humiliations that marked their reign. Imagine Carlos IV of France, a king who, despite wars and conflicts, maintained relatively stable control over his kingdom. Unlike Eduardo II, Carlos IV was a cunning politician who knew how to navigate the complexities of the French court and maintain order. Wondering what would have happened if Eduardo II had shown that same political ability? Remember the figure of Felipe VI of France, his contemporary. Felipe was known for his pragmatism and his ability to make difficult decisions. Unlike the defeated Eduardo II, Felipe VI knew how to maintain the unity of his kingdom in the face of internal and external threats. How would history have changed if Eduardo II had had the same determination and strategic vision? But what really is in the image that has reached us? The history of Eduardo II is full of exaggerations and distortions, molded by the interests of his enemies and the oral transmission of dramatic events. You can observe how the figure of a weak and effeminate king contrasts with the image of a capable and cunning monarch, an image that was perhaps built to justify his overthrow. The chronicles of the time, often written by their detractors, magnified their weaknesses and their sexual inclinations, making it a symbol of decline and perversion. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, for example, became a legend, amplified to the point of eclipsing other aspects of his reign. Remember that the story is written by the victors, and in this case, the version of Eduardo II that has prevailed is the one that best suited his enemies. Today, historians try to reconstruct a more objective image of Eduardo II, separating the reality of the black legend that pursues it. Its economic management, its internal and exterior policy is analyzed, looking for nuances beyond the image of the weak and depraved king. What do you think? Do you think the story has been fair to him? The answer, as always, is complex and depends on the perspective you adopt. The image of Eduardo II, deformed by the propaganda of his enemies, has resurfaced throughout history, fascinating artists and writers. You have seen how its history, full of mystery and controversy, has lent itself to innumerable interpretations from plays to movies. His figure has been reimagined again and again, offering diverse perspectives about his reign and tragic death. In the cinema, for example, its relationship with Piers Gaveston has been explored, sometimes presenting it as a pure love and sometimes as a symbol of corruption and weakness. Remember how these cinematographic representations have influenced the king's public perception, often oscillating between compassion and conviction. Literature has also contributed to keep Eduardo II's legend alive. Novels, poems, and plays have explored different facets of their personality and their reign, offering perspectives that go beyond traditional historical stories. Think about how these works have humanized their figure, revealing the complexity of the man behind the king. But remember, Eduardo II's interpretation in popular culture is always a construction. A subjective reading of historical facts, it is a reflection on power, love, betrayal, and ambition, universal issues that continue to resonate in us centuries later. So, was Eduardo II really so bad? Many paint him as a weak king, obsessed with his favorites and negligent with his duties. But was the truth? The answer, as is usually the case in history, is complex. His enemies, powerful nobles who sought control, launched a defamation campaign that has obscured his legacy. Remember that the information that reaches us is filtered by those who are interested in discrediting it. And what about your relationship with Piers Gaveston? Was it a simple friendship or something else? The chronicles, written by their adversaries, speak of a forbidden, extravagant, and harmful love for the kingdom. However, the exact nature of its bond is still the object of debate among historians. What is true is that Gaveston accumulated power and wealth, causing the anger of the nobility. Finally, how did Eduardo II really die? The official version speaks of a natural death in prison. But was it so? The circumstances of his death are full of mystery and suspicions. There is talk of a cruel and ruthless murder, orchestrated by his enemies to definitely silence him. The truth, like the nature of his reign, remains wrapped in the dark of history. /prosody, /speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. So what is Eduardo II's legacy? Despite his controversial life, his reign marked a turning point. His overthrow and subsequent ascent of his son Eduardo III, although violent, established a new order. You can see in history how the struggle for power and personal ambition often eclipse the true impact of a ruler. His reign, although plagued by conflicts, also promoted administrative and economic changes. Imagine the complexity of governing in such a turbulent era. Despite its errors and weaknesses, its figure has transcended the story, becoming a symbol of the fragility of real power and political instability. Its history reminds us that even kings, with all their apparent power, can be victims of circumstances. His tragic death, wrapped in mystery and violence, only adds one more layer to his fascinating and complex history. The image of a king reduced to prisoner in his own castle is a powerful metaphor of the ephemeral nature of power. To understand Eduardo II, You have not only to look at the raw stories of contemporary chroniclers, often biased by their loyalty to one faction or another. You need to deepen, imagine long hours in files, unraveling medieval manuscripts in ancient Latin or French. Think of the thorough task of comparing different versions of the same event, looking for the truth between the lines, between the accusations and the justifications. Real letters, financial records, legal documents, everything contributes to a more complete portrait. Do not forget the archaeological sources. The remains of castles, palaces, even bone remains analysis can provide crucial data. History is not limited to writings. It is found in the stones on Earth itself. And then there are modern interpretations. Historians from different eras and with diverse perspectives have analyzed primary sources, offering their own conclusions. His books, his academic articles are essential tools to understand the complexity of the figure of Eduardo II. You should consider these different interpretations, comparing them and contrasting them to form your own opinion. But this trip over time would not have been possible without the help of a great team. First, I want to thank my editor, whose patience and critical eye have been fundamental to shape this project. His dedication to historical precision and his ability to polish every detail have been invaluable. Without his work, this video simply would not exist. I also want to express my gratitude to our research team, who spent countless hours in archives and libraries, disregarding crucial information about Eduardo II's life. Its commitment to historical accuracy has been the cornerstone of this project, ensuring that we present a narrative as precise as possible. Of course, no production is complete without a talented design equipment and visual effects. His work has brought to life the England of the 14th century, transporting you to the castles and fields of that time. His ability to create an immersive atmosphere has been essential to make you feel as if you were there, in the heart of history. Finally, I want to thank you for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed this trip through the life of Eduardo II, a king who became a prisoner of his own castle. Your support is what motivates me to continue creating historical content like this. I hope you enjoyed learning about Eduardo II. If you liked it, give like and subscribe for more. What do you think about your tragic end? Leave it in the comments. /Prosody, /Speak,